and they're not alarmed. Why in the world should we be?
A week later, Israel received another warning from an astonishing source. Egypt's ally, King Hussein of Jordan, got wind of the plan to attack Israel. Fearing his own country could be drawn into war, he flew in secret to Israel to warn them. But the Israelis thought he was wrong. A week later, on October the 1st, the Egyptians staged their biggest military exercise to date, close to the Suez Canal. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir summoned her military and intelligence advisors. General Zaira was represented by his deputy.
After giving the positions of the enemy's forces, he concluded by saying that our enemies were not planning to attack us, because the conditions, which we call the Sadat concept, hadn't been fulfilled, meaning that Egypt didn't have the bombers or long-range missiles it needed.
But General Zaira and his deputy were ignoring a key rule of intelligence: to treat the enemy's military maneuvers with suspicion.
Zair's predecessor in military intelligence used to talk about Czechoslovakia, when the Soviets had a large military exercise. Then suddenly its troops turned around and invaded Czechoslovakia.
What's more, the Egyptian maneuvers were looking anything but normal.
We'd monitored radio traffic in previous Egyptian exercises, but this time they kept virtual radio silence. And then we spotted a huge convoy of 300 lorries bringing ammunition from Cairo to the Suez Canal. That was very unusual.
Lieutenant Colonel Brill was convinced war was imminent. His commanding officer dismissed his arguments, but he didn't give up.
I knew it was against the rules, but I went over my boss's head to his boss. And I convinced him. He then spoke to General Zaira and his deputy, but he couldn't convince them.
I stuck to my assessment that Egypt would not start a war before it had received the bombers and long-range missiles it wanted.
By October the 3rd, even Israeli reservists doing their military service on the canal were growing suspicious about the forces on the other side.
Groups of Egyptian soldiers started hammering spikes into the bank of the canal. They were for tying boats to, the sort of boats you'd use to cross the canal. We sent in a full report, but the response we got was, "Hey guys, relax, keep calm, we know all this." They were taking it too lightly. They were laughing at us, as if we knew nothing.
Israel's generals had become complacent. They ignored the signs of Egyptian forces preparing to cross the canal and simply accepted General Zaira's analysis that Egypt did not intend to attack.
The generals should have asked, what if he's wrong? They should at least have taken some basic action to stop the chance of Egypt launching a surprise attack. The army was not prepared for an attack, in spite of all the signs.
Israelis remained blissfully unaware and largely unprotected. Then, 2 days before the scheduled attack, Israeli intelligence received some startling information. The Russians were evacuating their diplomats from both Egypt and Syria.
This information seemed very strange. We had no explanation for what was going on.
The CIA also learned of the Russians' departure, but there too, many misread the signs.
My argument then was going to be a war, or they wouldn't be withdrawing their civilians and non-essential personnel. This is a classic indicator of hostilities. And still, our Arab analysts, the CIA Arab analysts, were very stubborn, as were the Israelis.
In Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Golda Meir asked her intelligence chief for his assessment.
I said that it seemed to me that the Russians thought the Syrians and Egyptians were going to attack us.
But as notes from their meeting show, his analysis did not stop there.
After he said that, he added that if the Soviets did think the Arabs were going to attack, they didn't understand the Arabs. In other words, the Russians were mistaken.
General Zaira still clung to his belief that Egypt would not attack.
Some people find it very hard to change their mind once they've come to a firm decision. So Zaira, despite all the intelligence reports in the week before the war, which could really only be interpreted as meaning Egypt was indeed going to start a war, Zaira stuck with his old analysis to the very last moment.
The next morning, October the 5th, the Egyptian Chief of Staff took a last look at the front line.
I looked across the canal and couldn't see the enemy doing anything. I was very happy. I went to President Sadat and said, even if they find out now, I don't care.
Only a last-minute warning late that night from Israel's top Egyptian spy finally persuaded the Israeli military that Egypt really was about to attack. The next day was Yom Kippur, Israel's holiest day. The call for reservists to report for duty went out at 10 a.m. At 2 p.m., as reservists waited for orders, Egypt made its move.
Suddenly, two huge mushrooms of yellow smoke enveloped our bunker. I thought it was a gas attack. I was convinced that at any moment our Air Force and our troops would counterattack, and the whole thing would be over.
But the Israeli Air Force could not penetrate the Egyptian missile cover. Those on the front line were stranded.
That's the bunker along from ours. A guy called Max Mammon. That was really terrible. His last words were, "You abandoned us, you betrayed us, God will pay you back." He yelled, "I'm burning, I'm burning." Then he died.
The Egyptians had achieved their objective. They had crossed the canal and held their ground. It was only when the United States stepped in with a massive airlift of arms that Israel's forces regained their balance and pushed the Egyptians back across the front line. As the two nations negotiated a ceasefire, an Israeli government inquiry began poring over the causes of Israel's intelligence failure.
The Commission recommended setting up a new unit whose job is to examine a situation and come up with an analysis that challenges the accepted wisdom. It's called the Office of the Devil's Advocate. It still operates today, and sometimes it really does make people question the dominant analysis.
The root of Israel's intelligence failure had been a sense of superiority, combined with a flawed analysis of Egypt's war plans. Together, they had led Israel into believing their enemies would not be so stupid as to attack them. They were not the first to make such a mistake.
The best example of this, perhaps, is American appreciations of Japanese intentions in late 1941, even when the Americans realized that fleets were moving in Southeast Asia, that the Japanese army and the Japanese